A lot of sunshine, blue skies, marine clouds. Just a perfect day to go outside and relax. That's your forecast. We'll be right back.
Yeah, sunny days, sunny days, sunny days. No clouds in the sky, about to get away. Feels like it's been a freaking decade. Sorry, don't call me cause I'm gonna be on break. Sunny day, make way. All the stress and doubt, yeah, not today. Feels like it's been a freaking decade. Sorry, don't.
Last year when I wanted to buy a new camera, being a Sony shooter and having an A7 III meant that I could only upgrade to one camera at that moment in time, which was the Sony A7S III. But the thing is, I knew that the A7 Mark IV was going to come out at any moment, and with it now being out, how does it really stand up against the A7S III? And when I bought the A7S III, was that the right choice? Now, if you want to get into like the deep depths of camera technology, there are a lot of differences between this, which is the A7S III, and the A7 IV, what I'm filming on right now. You could say that the autofocus is possibly slightly better on the A7 IV, especially with the extra features which have been put on it, and technically the A7 IV is meant to be better for photos because it's got a higher megapixel sensor. Whereas this should be technically better at low light because it's only got 12 megapixels, but regardless of that, this is still a year older. So really, shouldn't the A7 IV be just as good, if not better? This is by far one of the hardest comparisons I've ever done. So the Sony A7 Mark IV and the Sony A7S Mark III against each other. Where do I even start? Firstly, let's start with why am I actually doing this? If you've watched one of my recent videos, you will have seen that I hired the Sony A7 Mark IV from Hire a Camera, and the whole point of it was to see whether it would be a suitable camera for me to replace my trusty A7 Mark III. Obviously, it's a better camera than the A7 Mark III because it's the A7 Mark IV. But you see, I'm a massive A7S Mark III user, but I still use my A7 Mark III when it comes to doing wedding photography or just whenever I need a B cam. But with the vast changes between the A7 Mark III and the A7 Mark IV, it's obviously a no-brainer to upgrade. But if you take away the factor of megapixels away from the A7 Mark IV, how does it actually stand up against the A7S Mark III? Quite simply, do I go out and buy another A7S Mark III, or do I go out and buy an A7 IV and save myself over £1,000? So the A7 IV doesn't come with 100 or 120 frames a second when shooting in 4K in S&Q mode. So technically that's a point to the A7S Mark III and not the A7 Mark IV. And when you shoot in 50 or 60 frames a second in S&Q mode, you get a crop. Some may like it, some may not, but if you need your 24mm lens to be a true 24mm lens when shooting in S&Q mode, then the A7 IV isn't for you and you should go out and buy the A7S Mark III. And that's all for today. Thank you very much for watching. See you later. But if you don't, then keep watching. Shooting in 50 or 60 frames a second isn't all that bad, and even with a crop in certain situations, it's perfect. As somebody who makes a lot of YouTube videos, and if I had a Sony A7 Mark IV, I would only need to have my 16-35 lens with me, and I could pretty much make most videos that I put out here on the channel. I wouldn't have to carry around a 55mm or an 85mm lens just to get them extra range shots, I guess you could say. But regardless, if you're shooting in tight situations and really you're only using a prime, then shooting at 50 frames a second in S&Q mode with that crop, well, it will throw you off from time to time. Now, at 50 frames a second, you may be sat thinking, it's not that slow. And you're right, at 50 frames a second, you ain't gonna be able to get rid of all the lumps and bumps in your footage like you can with 100 or 120 frames a second, or even further. But you're wrong, the Sony A7 IV actually comes with a secret weapon, but we'll get around to that shortly. The A7 Mark IV has much higher resolution in comparison to the A7S Mark III, 33 megapixels over the 12, and obviously downsamples from 7K down to 4K when filming in just standard 4K movie mode. So technically, 4K from this camera in standard movie mode should be better than the Sony A7S Mark III, but you can be the judge of that. So it's a current low light test with the Sony A7S III. I'm currently filming at S-Log3 at 10,000 ISO in a little bit of a dark hut thing. But obviously I just changed the aperture down to f14 to counteract the compensation of the bright ISO. So at 10,000 ISO on the Sony A7S III, this should pretty much be the most noisiest the image is ever going to be, because as soon as you go up to 12,800 ISO, this is like the dual native ISO, so it's like going back down to 640 ISO, but still having all the sensitivity to the light. So at this moment in time, you should see no to very little amount of noise. And it should be a similar situation when we come over to the A7 IV. Once again, still filming at S-Log3, 10,000 ISO, so the noise should still be as bad as it was on the A7S III. And now when we go over to 12,800 ISO, the same base ISO as what it is on the A7S III, we should be back to having no to minimal amount of noise. And this is where I messed up. I'll always hold my hands up if I make a mistake, but do you know why? Did you spot the mistake? I got carried away on this test. I was tired. 4 days of filming, including a wedding, testing. I was tired. You see, on the Sony A7S III, as you may know, when you're shooting in S-Log3, you have two different base ISOs, 640 and then 12,800. Well, me being tired, I somehow thought that the Sony A7 IV had the same base ISOs. And guess what? It doesn't. No, it doesn't. Oh dear. The base ISO when it comes to S-Log3 on the A7 IV is 800 ISO and 3200 ISO. So this test at first glance is just an absolute failure. But just look at the footage. This was shot at 12,800 ISO and it looks really, really good. Technically speaking, the Sony A7S III should be much better in low light than the A7 Mark IV, not only because of the pixel density on the sensor, but also because the base ISO is much higher, or the second base ISO is much higher on the A7S Mark III than it is on the A7 Mark IV. But I think you'll agree, the footage from the A7 Mark IV speaks for itself. Moving on to dynamic range. This is the shot from the A7 Mark IV. And then this is the shot from the A7S Mark III. Which do you prefer? They both have good bits and they both have bad bits, but something to point out is all the footage you're seeing from outside of this room is being shot and only corrected using a Rec 709 LUT. It's got no actual grading or correction or anything on top of it. But for me personally in this test, I prefer the look of the Sony A7 Mark IV over the look of the Sony A7S III straight out of camera. For me, it looks a lot more natural to what it would be in real life. But I do feel like the Sony A7S Mark III gave you a little bit more detail in the shadows, perhaps because it's lifted ever so slightly over the A7 Mark IV, and really with a little bit of tweaking, you could easily match both of these clips next to each other. As for the detail outside on the trees, it's pretty much the same. Maybe the A7S Mark III has a little bit better, there's certain parts of the tree where it looks a little bit better on the A7S Mark III than it does on the A7 Mark IV, but these weren't shot in a controlled environment, and for me having to put one camera down to pick up another one to expose it correctly and then do the shot, you never know, the exposure outside could have changed slightly, but yeah, you can see the results and you can decide for yourself. In terms of taking photos on the A7 IV against the A7S III, it's pretty much the same. You obviously get more megapixels on the A7 IV over the A7S III, with it being 33 megapixel against 12 megapixel. But in terms of actually taking photos, the autofocus, in my eyes, in my opinion, it's not really any different. You obviously get a few more features on the A7 IV with it being a new camera, such as bird autofocus and stuff, but it depends how much you're really going to use that. One thing I did notice between the A7 IV and the A7S III is the screen on the A7S III actually looks a lot nicer. The viewfinder actually looks a lot nicer than what it does on the A7 IV. I feel like the photos on the A7S III on the screen and in the viewfinder when you're looking back, it looks a lot nicer than what it does on the A7 IV. But whether that actually matters when it comes to taking photos or video, if you know the end result is going to be that good, then does it actually matter what it looks like when it comes to playback? But overall, the menus are the same or as close as can be if you want to get really picky. For me, having to pick up the Sony A7 IV for the first time, it felt really normal, I guess you could say, because I'm so used to using an A7S Mark III. Over what we used to have on the menu system for the A7 III and other cameras before that, that was just an awful menu system. And moving to the A7S III at the first, it was really, really hard for me to do. But specifically between the A7S Mark III and the A7 IV, it's pretty much a dead heat when it comes to usability. Because these cameras are so customizable, anything you want to change, you can just go into the menu system and just change it. In terms of the stabilization between the two, you would expect them to be around the same. Both of them have the same type of steady shot technology, with this one having the active and also the just standard steady shot, the same as the A7S III. But I do actually feel like the A7 IV has the upper hand on stabilization over the A7S III. The reason why is on the two cameras, you have two types of stabilization. You have steady shot and then active stabilization. Active stabilization is where the image is cropped in by around about 10%, meaning you got a little bit of space around the edge of the sensor.
Therefore, your image can move around a little bit more on the sensor can move around a little bit more, and you get better stabilization. That's what causes the edges of the screen on something like a 16mm lens to wobble ever so slightly. On the A7S III, you only get active stabilization in the standard movie mode, whereas on the Sony A7 IV, you get active stabilization even in S&Q mode. It's not a major thing, but when you're shooting in active stabilization in S&Q mode, it does give you that upper hand, and it's really useful to have in a camera which can only shoot 50 or 60 frames a second, because you won't be able to get rid of the lumps and bumps in your footage as easily as you would if you were filming 100 or 120 frames a second. Yesterday, me and Tim photographed a whole wedding. At the end of the day, I asked him what his opinion was on the A7 IV and whether he thinks it would be suitable and whether he is actually going to go out and buy one. And I think his response hit the nail right on the head. The Sony A7 IV is a phenomenal photography camera. It does everything you could possibly think of and more when it comes to photos. And it's definitely a step up over the A7 III and the A7S III in both respects in terms of technology and also the megapixels. And we both said for the style of wedding videos that we do, it does kind of suit our needs, but more as a B cam to the A7S III rather than being a main camera. The reason being is that we use a lot of 100 frames a second in our wedding videos. It may be very cliche, but it's the style that we do, and then we use 25 frames a second captured throughout the speeches and vows to help tell the story. So not having 100 frames a second at all to use at our dispersal, then it kind of makes the camera not pointless, but not as useful as what it could be. But at the same time, if you're shooting at 60 frames a second and you use the crop, he really likes shooting on 24mm on the A7S III, and then on the A7 IV, he really likes shooting 55mm for photos. When it came to videos, he likes the 85mm look, so going to 60 frames a second with the 4K crop is completely fine.
And I think this goes into it even further when I say that these videos, these comparison videos, which I make for you guys, are really hard for me to make. Admittedly, they are fun and I find them really interesting, but they are so hard for me to make and make fair and get the results that you guys want to see. As a wedding videographer and photographer, the A7 Mark IV is better than the A7S Mark III, but only in certain situations. But in others, it's simply not, and the A7S III is much better than the Sony A7 Mark IV. But when it comes to me being a YouTube creator, the A7 Mark IV would suit me perfectly, and for the extra £1,000 I'm saving, you could put that towards a really nice lens. So, the big question, will I be buying another A7S Mark III, or will I be saving the money and buying an A7 Mark IV? After thinking about it for 6 months, using them both, testing them both, and making this video, I have no idea. I can't even answer that question right now. But the thing is, I wouldn't be upset if I went out and bought a Sony A7 Mark IV over an A7S Mark III, because it's still a really good camera, and perhaps you should go out and buy the A7 Mark IV over the A7S Mark III as well. If you do, then make sure you subscribe to the channel, because over the next couple of weeks I've got a full setup video about how I set up this Sony A7 Mark IV to make this video and all the other videos I've been making recently, and pretty much show you how to get the very best out of your new Sony camera. I'll see you there.